Hello, History 362. So I know you've got your midterm coming up, so I'm just going to do a short video that focuses on one of the most peculiar aspects of the Ptolemaic dynasty, namely its practice of royal incest, brother-sister marriage between royals. Now, I'm doing this not simply because brother-sister marriage is a kind of icky curiosity of Hellenistic history, but rather, I think this is actually an example of how sometimes the study of history really opens kind of broader questions about what it means to be a human being. And this is why I think history is such an important component of the broader study of the humanities, just trying to figure out what it means to be human. Fundamentally, I feel that the study of the humanities is this kind of tension between appreciating how much we have in common with other human beings, separated by both time and space, and also appreciating how radically different we can be from other human beings. Again, also separated through time and space. And that's sort of that tension, sometimes wonderful, sometimes weird, sometimes unpleasant, is basically what I think exploring the human experience is fundamentally about. Now, the problem of brother-sister marriage also cuts to a core problem in another kind of discipline of the humanities, namely anthropology. Particularly in the 20th century, anthropologists were almost obsessed with the incest taboo, oftentimes seen as a universal taboo, present in almost every human society, that forbids marriage and sexual relations between family members. And of course, there is some cultural relativity about what constitutes incest, forbidden sexual relations between relatives. Some cultures, for example, encourage marriage between cousins. Some cultures allow marriage or even encourage, at times, marriage between aunts and uncles and their nieces and nephews. But almost every culture prohibits sexual relations and marriage between fathers and mothers and their children, and usually, almost always, between brother and full brother and sister. So any kind of exception really is an exception that proves what seems to be a profoundly universal rule, one that you can find in cultures radically separated by time, space, and other cultural elements, so much that it even seems fundamental. Indeed, in the middle of the 20th century, anthropologists, particularly Claude Levi-Strauss, almost suggested basically that the incest taboo is a universal taboo because you need it to have culture. If everyone is simply marrying their brother or sister, then every single human family doesn't really need to interact with any other family. They can just be their own kind of internal unit. But once you start engaging in exogamy, marrying someone else's sister or marrying someone else's brother, you start forming kind of a wider network. And this leads to the creation of, you need a wider culture. You need symbols and that can be interpreted beyond just your sort of internal unit. So for anthropologists, again, 20th century anthropologists, and some of you may be taking anthropology, the stakes are pretty high when we have an exception to the rule, when we have full brothers and full sisters married. Now, it should be noted that while brother-sister incest is largely, again, with the handful of exceptions, prohibited in most societies, one reoccurring exception is the concept of royal incest, in that royal families in different societies, ranging from the Ptolemies in Egypt to, say, Hawaiian and Incan monarchs. These are radically removed families that aren't necessarily copying one another, as well as the pharaohs of Egypt, do practice brother-sister marriage only for the royal line. So this seems to be a strategy that royal families, on rare occasion, do pursue. And the Ptolemies, therefore, join this kind of this cluster. So that's sort of one thing we should consider. And of course, as I noted, it may be important, although it is still debated, that the Ptolemies, who are, of course, plunking down as colonizers upon this native kingdom that has a real sense of its own traditions, are positioning themselves as part of this kind of royal tradition, this pharaonic tradition, which does include occasional brother-sister marriage. For example, King Tut, they did a genetic test. He himself is the product of a full brother and sister marriage. So it does happen, again, that may be relevant. Now, one thing that should be noted, and again, I mentioned every society prohibits incest, but every society outside of the core family group has a slightly different definition of incest. We live in a society actually where that definition expands outward significantly to the point that generally in the United States, for example, the marriage of first cousins is considered, in some places it's illegal, but is at least considered moderately taboo. Again, that's not true in many other historical societies where actually in many societies, including most ancient societies, your cousin is actually a pretty darn good person to marry. Just outside of the family enough, but enough also that it maintains sort of the alliances, say, between two families or clans or lineages. Now, it is important to note that the Ptolemies do not always practice full brother-sister marriage. The first comes with Ptolemy II. Now, Ptolemy II inherits from his kingdom from Ptolemy I. He also has a first wife who is exogamous. She's the daughter, her name is Arsinoe. She's the daughter of Lysimachus, that ill-fated warlord who had for a while controlled Thrace before his defeat at the Battle of Corupedion. In this exogamous marriage, Ptolemy II produces all of his children. However, the marriage doesn't work out, perhaps particularly with the death of Lysimachus. Being married to his daughter doesn't do Ptolemy very much good, and he therefore contracts another marriage with his full sister, whose confusingly name also happens to be Arsinoe. In some of these instances, we have there's a lot of repeated names in Hellenistic dynasties, and in some instances, they go by a different name before their sort of accession, and then there's a regal name that keeps getting used again and again and again. And we do know, I think we have less evidence with the Ptolemies, we do know, for example, that in the Seleucid dynasty, for example, some of these Antiochuses and Seleucids go by different names before they become king, kind of in the same way that popes have different names before they become pope. At any rate, our Ptolemy II marries his full sister, Arsinoe, who's oftentimes referred to as Arsinoe II, and this is our first brother-sister marriage. Now, again, we may note some of the pros and cons. The Egyptians may at least be open to this if they're familiar with a tradition of pharaonic brother-sister marriage. Con, the Ptolemies frequently do not necessarily go way out of their way to make the Egyptians happy, even if they are willing to present themselves in an Egyptian fashion, whether it's statues of them in pharaonic garb or putting up inscriptions in hieroglyphics and demotic. But they do the kind of easy things. At the end of the day, they're just out there to really exploit the Egyptians, and a brother-sister marriage really isn't going to politically necessarily change the tide, right, of Egyptian public opinion. So there may be a slight gain, but I should stress that it's slight. The Greek subjects, the Greco-Macedonian subjects who are the most important supporters of the Ptolemies, the people who are the clerics that are serving in the army, that are actually dominating the Egyptian peasantry, the people in the actual court in Alexandria, they find this really icky. And indeed, there's even a court poet who sort of thinks this is so gross that he starts writing a very critical poetry, and is supposedly first drummed out of the court and drummed out of Egypt, and then eventually imprisoned and murdered, according to some stories, because of his opposition to royal incest. So there's some real cons with the population that seemingly the Ptolemies need the most. Greeks, while the Greeks are, again, have allowed some types of incest, they do for example, for an Athenian it's perfectly okay for a woman to marry her uncle. They find this pretty gross. So there actually seem to be some real cons early on. Now, one thing that is notable, the marriage between Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, while it is actually put out there in dynastic propaganda, produces no children. So it's actually unclear when we actually think about the kind of nature of the incest taboo and questions of is this sort of hardwired into human beings. Most of us who have siblings would probably think, yes, it is. It's unclear that they actually consummate this marriage. We have no proof other than we have propaganda that emphasizes their closeness. It's not impossible, indeed, that this is perhaps a bit of a strategy. We know that one problem that Hellenistic kings have is they practice royal polygamy, and there's too many women. It's unclear who the children are. So maybe in marrying his sister, and maybe even having a chaste marriage, this is a way of ensuring that A, he has a marriage, but B, that they can be used for sort of royal presentation, but that the children from the previous marriage are clearly marked out as successes. Indeed, the Ptolemy III is the product of an exogamous marriage, and Ptolemy III, the next generation, doesn't marry a stepsister. He engages in an exogamous marriage of his own. So for a while, this may be a kind of one-off experiment. Again, we might say, okay, so at a certain level, there seem to be more cons than pros. One other pro of engaging in brother-sister marriage is actually probably why it does pop up again and again amongst royals. It's symbolic, and it has some symbolic importance. One, it suggests that the dynasty is so above everybody else that it can't really be troubled to interact in a marital way. So clearly it is proclaiming a very high vision of the dynasty. And it seems that this is the reason that other royal examples of royal incest, this seems to be kind of a motive. Look, we are so above you guys that we can't even deign to breed with you. We are our own rarefied bloodline. Although again, notably, there's no breeding between Ptolemy II and Arsinoe. But even we can't even deign to marry with you. So that could be one thing. Certainly, a part of that high claim also can tie into myth. So a lot of creation myths, particularly in polytheistic societies, have a kind of problem that for both first gods and first men, there's not enough people to marry and mate with. And so there's some assumption of incest, either assumption of incest or explicit references to incest, including even in the generation after Adam and Eve, right? Now, for the Greeks, it is very clear that Zeus and Hera are full brother and sister. They are both the son and daughter of Kronos and Rhea, and therefore that they are themselves engaged in this kind of godly incestuous marriage, which for the Greeks that seems less weird just because, well, they're just the gods. They go by different rules. Aha. There's something to be said about, well, I'm a king. I go by different rules than the rules for the rest of humanity. I have more in common with Zeus and Hera than the gods. This also may tie into maybe some slight bonuses for your presentation to your native population, because brother-sister marriages also turn up in Egyptian myth, particularly in the fundamental myth, a fundamental myth of the story of Isis and Osiris, who are both husband and wife, full brother and sister. And it is the union that actually transcends the death of Osiris, but the union between Isis and Osiris is what produces Horus, who as a god is kind of the manifestation of pharaonic power. So on one hand, that may be the kind of payoff of saying, look, we're special, we're different, the rules don't apply to us, and by the way, that puts us in closer company to the gods in terms of both populations, whether it's Greeks or Egyptians. That puts us closer to the stories of the gods than it does to the sort of humdrum marriage and breeding of mortals, where you guys practice exogamy, but we're different, we're special, we're rarefied. That may be a lot of why this practice starts. Now, going down the line, it skips a generation. So Ptolemy III has an exogamous marriage. Ptolemy IV marries his full sister, Arsinoe. This is the first incestuous Ptolemaic marriage that produces a child. And indeed, there is going to be an acceleration of incestuous marriages later in the dynasty. We skip another generation. Ptolemy V marries the daughter of Antiochus the Great, a marriage that is actually forced upon him due to the Ptolemaic defeat in the 5th Syrian War. But going into the 2nd century, incestuous marriage starts to become the norm in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Perhaps because, again, those kind of symbolic benefits pick up. The idea of, again, we're special, we're rarefied, our bloodline is rarefied. It also may be a kind of useful way, again, notably the first marriage is not about producing children, but again, it may become a useful way later in the dynasty, as Ptolemaic kings have a lot of non-incestuous sex. They probably are producing a number of non-incestuous children. But again, that can create its own dynastic confusion. We see this in other dynasties, including in the Antigonids, where we have Perseus and Demetrius scheming against each other in the court, and eventually Demetrius is executed. That's what happens when you have different sons or different potential heirs by different women in this kind of court of with the Hellenistic polygamy that is practiced. And so if you're practicing polygamy, one potential way of marking out the error, marking out the line that has precedence, is to say it's the special line produced by this highly unusual marriage with the sister. Now, it is notable that the Ptolemies kind of pioneer brother-sister marriage. They do get followed in it by the Seleucids, in that Antiochus the Great, having defeated the Ptolemies, having forced Ptolemy the Fifth into an exogamous marriage, subsequently marries his heir, Seleucus IV, to his full sister. And indeed, that full sister will subsequently marry a series of her brothers, as sort of being married to her becomes the marker of who is going to be the next king. It's a way of managing the succession, and also suggesting that maybe the Seleucids too, now having proven themselves militarily superior to their Ptolemaic counterparts, are a rarefied bloodline that can't deign to mingle even with any other kingly lineages. So it is, although again the prevalence of incestuous marriage will remain much higher in the Ptolemies down to the end of the dynasty than it will in the Seleucids. So again, on one hand, this royal incest, I think, certainly does challenge the near universality of the taboo. In some ways, again, that challenge to the taboo may be part of its appeal. It's a way of saying, of marking out the singular nature of that royal family and that royal bloodline. And it is actually part of a small number of examples of royal incest that, again, proves the rule of you don't marry your brother or your sister. Anyway, I hope for those of you who are taking anthropology, for example, this may be a useful lecture. And again, I think for all of us, there are reasons to study history beyond just the blow by blow. Sometimes it forces us to think about kind of the broader problem of what does it mean to be human. So at any rate, good luck on your midterm. This will probably be the last lecture I drop this week. We will talk a little bit more about the Ptolemies, and I think I'm going to have our readings for next week be a little bit on the Ptolemies. It's fascinating and important dynasty, and then in next week we'll move on to some other issues related to kings and cities in the Hellenistic world. So good luck on your midterm. I'll talk to you soon.